Good afternoon. Welcome to SCRA's presidential address. It is my great pleasure, privilege, and honor to introduce your new president, Dr. Kwesi Brookings. Not only is he a renowned scholar, community psychologist, activist, he is now at Michigan State University, where he's both a professor and a vice provost. And even though some might say he's moved into the dark side, he remains filled with light. I am extremely happy to, earlier I passed the gavel, I'm extremely happy to welcome him to the podium. SCRA is in great hands, and I look forward to a continuing collaboration. Thank you.
First time I've had a gavel, so, it bounced. Thanks, Madam Past President. I very much appreciate you. Thank you all for coming. Glad to see folks in the room, in the space. We're excited with Division 27, Society for Community Research and Action, about what the future holds. And our expectation is that everyone in this room, even if not especially the future members, the younger future members who are paying no attention to what I am saying at this point, will be involved as well. And I know Mama will make sure that that's the case. I have a talk that I want to also do a discussion. I usually have slides, and I usually try to make it interactive, but I apologize in advance. I just got words that I want to share with you for this presidential address. But I want to begin with words of thanks, primarily to so many people who have been involved with the organization over the last, my involvement has been the last year and a half. As in the presidential stream, as president-elect in particular. And of course, to start with our executive director, Amber Kelly, who has been extremely important to the work that we've been doing and the progress that we've made. I'll talk a little bit about that. Would not have happened without her. And of course, Yadiga, what is Yadiga's official title?
Administrative coordinator.
Administrative coordinator, who hopefully will show up and soon we can congratulate, who will not show up soon, but she's in the mix, making sure that she's coordinating stuff.
Yes, she's coordinating.
So this is no shade on her. We're happy that she's here doing the work. Our 2022-23 officers, Chris Nettles, who is our treasurer, who could not be at APA this year. He's off doing his thing in retreat space. Michelle I thought I was going to get it right. Schlehofer, thank you. Who is our secretary, and as we mentioned, Yvette Flores, who is now the past president. Of course, the members of our executive committee, many names, I won't list them all. But all of the councils, committees, and interest groups, as well as members at large and all the other people who have responsibility, I want to thank them. And those who have stepped up to serve, particularly on our strategic planning process, which I'll talk a little bit about, I'm glad to be with all of y'all. I want to begin with acknowledgments. I'd like to begin by honoring my ancestral background, and by doing so, honoring myself and all of those listening to or reading this presidential address, which we will be publishing in some form soon. I ask permission from the Creator to allow me to begin. I ask permission from my ancestors to allow me the space to make my contribution over this next year and beyond to the society. And I acknowledge all the peoples, those living and those who occupy the many other realms of our existence. Those who have lived, worked, and stewarded the lands and the communities we have named the United States of America. The indigenous peoples who were the first to shape these primal lands for tens of thousands of years. The people of African descent who were forced into these spaces and despite enduring the ma'afa of enslavement, emerged and continuously struggled to positively transform this world each time it fails to embrace what it claims to be. The communities who have been subjected to colonization, false borders, unequal and inequitable conditions of living, and forced to justify their existence constantly, and despite this, continue to emerge to positively transform this world each time it fails to embrace what it claims to be. The peoples whose ancestors escaped from other worlds in an imperfect and much too often violent quest to create communities where opportunities could flourish and health and wealth and wellness could be realized. And despite the deep and persistent failures of this quest, many, but not all, have emerged to positively transform this world each time it fails to embrace who and what it claims to be. The people who are constantly subjected to existential violence that challenges their ways of being in this world, and despite this, continue to emerge to positively transform this world each time it fails to embrace who and what it claims to be. To all who see themselves connected to these human conditions and communities, I say, Sawubona. I see you. We see you. We ask the Creator Spirit to give us the patience, mindfulness, and wisdom to see those things before our eyes, those blessings and those injustices, to speak on them and to take action, to never rest until we have moved our world a bit further toward a life of liberation for ourselves and others. To this end, I humbly acknowledge those human ancestors and trust that they approve of our individual and collective work. The title of this talk is Through 2023 and Beyond, Dreaming Community Psychology Forward. Our dreams shape visions, our visions help us to create goals, and of course, dreams and visions risk becoming meaningless without action. So, we don't just dream, we have to act. My goals for this talk are threefold. To position myself in what I call the project of community psychology, to offer some thoughts on the state of SCRA, Society for Community Research and Action, as it seeks to carry forward the vision of community psychology, and to lay out what we can collectively accomplish in the next few years that builds on the positive accomplishments of the past. I begin with who I am. I identify as an African community psychologist. I spell African with a capital K in the middle of the word, instead of usually what you see as the C. As you probably gathered from the opening of this talk, I embrace my ancestral home and heritage. I care deeply about communities of African descent in the U.S. and across the globe. By extension, I care deeply about our human communities because all people are African people. If we get it right with African communities, we get it right, period. As a scholar, much of my work is focused on participatory and action research with communities within and outside of the academy. This praxis is conceptually and theoretically grounded in critical and socio-political consciousness, which are the precursors to transformative and liberatory change. This is foremost in my mind as I assume leadership responsibilities as president of SCRA. Over the past several years, I have studied and keenly observed leadership. Leadership works best when it is intentional, purposeful, and constantly reflective about the role. I view leadership as a sacred responsibility. I approach leadership from an African-centered perspective. It should be horizontal and collective. It should be shared. And as Aminu Kano, a Muslim socialist politician from Nigeria, once stated, anyone who wants to be a leader must be the servant, not the boss, of those they want to serve. What I have observed over the past couple of years in my role within the presidential stream of the organization is that SCRA has not been explicit in its leadership expectations over the years. We have not ritualized the responsibility. We don't emphasize the expectation of carrying forward the mission of SCRA or even community psychology. We don't set expectations for growing trust and inclusivity in the organization. We assume all of this is within the role of the leaders, and indeed, many of the leaders I've known and worked with embrace these expectations, but we don't make it explicit. Perhaps we should. I became a member of SCRA about 40 years ago. I will be the third black male, and by my count, the 11th person of color to join the presidential stream of the organization. That represents almost 20% of the 57 presidents the organization has had since 1967. And as I passed through the National Portrait Gallery yesterday, the President's Portrait Gallery, we have had more presidents than the United States of America. Good or bad thing, I don't know. And as far as I know, none of them have been impeached, although unfortunately some have resigned. In addition, 4 out of 5 of the most recent persons in the presidential stream have been people of color. And for the first time, a black woman is currently president-elect. Our membership also represents diverse backgrounds, communities, and identities, contributing to the organization through its interest groups, councils, committees, and students, or just straight-up volunteering, as we saw during the recent biennial conference at Morehouse College in Atlanta. While I don't have the numbers to compare, I suspect that represents a good amount of inclusivity relative to the other APA divisions. And on a side note, I found out earlier today, SCRA's membership is one of the higher memberships across all divisions. We'll talk a little bit about this. We must give a caveat to that because most of SCRA's members are not APA members. So we can talk about that later. Yet, while SCRA has always been my professional home, it has not been my psychological or spiritual home. While my identity as a community psychologist is deeply present in the society, the African part of my identity has gone wanting. And this has been the case for many of our current, past, and prospective members across many intersectional identities. Yet again, there are those of us who have been and continue to be deeply engaged in the community psychology project, those who challenge us to be our best community psychology selves. To the extent that this tension and dialectic does not get mean or ugly, it represents a healthy community, a society that is adequately reflective, striving for continuous improvement, and seeking to build and sustain a resilient and competent professional community. Unfortunately, in my observations and what others have expressed in various ways, community psychologists often don't do community well. This is particularly true regarding the past few years with the Society for Community Research and Action. I stepped into the presidential stream at a time of deep psychological angst, interpersonal tension, anger, and at times incivility. While the officers, executive committee, and many of our members have worked diligently to address these issues, along with our administrative teams, there is an ongoing need for healing. For me, I rely on my work over the past years in critical and socio-political consciousness to both understand and take action on these organizational needs. The key dimension of critical consciousness are to become aware of the social and political forces that affect our worlds. These forces are not necessarily complex, but understanding them often requires us to step back from our own worldviews that are deeply entrenched in our professional, academic, scholarly, ethnic, racial, and personal identities, to engage in socio-political development. I see this as necessary for us as individuals within the organization and the organization as a whole. As our colleagues recently wrote in an American Psychologist special issue on the contribution of Black psychologists, Quote, a central component of socio-political development is engaging in critical social analysis to understand oppressive systems and how oppression is rooted in and grows out of cultural norms. Socio-political development contends that critical social analysis is a birthplace of critical consciousness and a catalyst to social and political engagement. This critical social analysis then should result in an ideological stance that prioritizes liberation. Critical social analysis may be fluid, but should push the boundaries of the status quo away from oppression and towards liberation. Unquote. Socio-political development arose out of a psychosocial effort to understand and address oppressive circumstances. It was intended primarily for those subjected to circumstances of racial and other forms of oppression. We argue that socio-political development is equally important for those who generally do not see themselves among the oppressed. The Society for Community Research and Action is engaged in a socio-political development process. This is happening individually and collectively. Being or becoming appropriately, critically conscious requires intentional and sustained effort, a level of reflexivity, and a willingness to sacrifice our often unearned notions of power and privilege. This, we assume rightly or wrongly, is well understood by community psychologists. After all, this way of being in the world has drawn many of us to the field and is how we understand we must engage the communities we work with and those we live in. Yet, as Yvette Flores stated in her presidential address last year, we have much work ahead, and we need you as members to participate. And I will add, to participate in this socio-political development process. 2, as was expressed in the call to action, to develop a deep and critical understanding of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. 2, acknowledge our complicity and maintenance of white supremacy and white supremacy culture in SCRA and in the work we do as community psychologists. It's an ongoing project. Many of us consider this love work, a labor of love. Those who step up to serve do it out of love for people, love for community, love for the organization, love for community psychology, and love for what we offer the world. It is bold. It is a bold idea. It is a bold project. It is a bold ask. But if we are not bold, then why are we here? I want to shift for a bit to talk about how we move the community psychology project forward, while recognizing the many downsides of institutionalizing ideas and worldviews. Institutionalization is always a tough word, both for what it represents as well as how to say it. I want to talk about the importance of institutions to community psychology. And of course, having been primarily born in the academy, the development and dissemination of CP, I'll call it, has occurred chiefly through our researchers, scholars, and practitioners, and by extension, our academic training programs. SCRA, of course, also represents the institutionalization of community psychology. Dissemination of the CP idea is done through our publications, AJCP, American Journal of Community Psychology, and the Community Psychologists, to name 2, the research and publications that our members do, and our biennial conference. But perhaps the most prolific way we disseminate community psychology is through the networks of people and organizations we all are connected to, within and outside of the field of psychology. As a result, community psychology is everywhere. If we just focus on psychology, our values, principles, methods, and even worldviews are represented in many ways across APA divisions, and as represented by this current conference, increasingly in the American Psychological Association itself. As a reminder for most of you, and perhaps an introduction for some of you, bear with me, I want to talk about what our mission is. Quote, the Society for Community Research and Action is an organization devoted to advancing theory, research, and social action. Its members are committed to promoting health and empowerment and to preventing problems in communities, groups, and individuals. SCRA serves many different disciplines that focus on community research and action. And although our values are not posted on the website, we do point to 4 broad principles that guide the organization. Community research and action requires explicit attention to and respect for diversity among peoples and settings. Human competencies and problems are best understood by viewing people within their social, cultural, economic, geographic, and historical context. Community research and action is an active collaboration among researchers, practitioners, and community members that use multiple methodologies. Such research and action must be undertaken to serve those community members directly concerned and should be guided by their needs and preferences as well as by their active participation. And lastly, change strategies are needed at multiple levels in order to foster settings that promote competence and well-being. And finally, all of this is in service to our vision. To, quote, the Society for Community Research and Action will have a strong global impact on enhancing well-being and promoting social justice for all people by fostering collaboration where there is division and empowerment where there is oppression. I think it's particularly important that we keep the mission, the principles, and the vision in mind at all times, because to lose sight of them risk us getting too far off track. It should also be said, however, that although many of us would like to think that community psychology is exceptional, it is not. Community psychology in the United States arises out of a tremendous social, economic, and yes, psychological upheaval in the country. A set of upheavals. Thus, while community psychology may have its unique history and trajectory, the mission, values, and vision are shared across disciplinary, political, and societal worlds. So from at least one angle, CP has done and is doing very well if we only focus on how what we value, believe, and do is represented in so many places. Having said that, how do we make sense of the struggles, decline and disappearance of training programs, and the health and viability of the Society for Community Research and Action? Those questions, of course, are not new. Almost every presidential address has asked them in one way or another since the late 1960s. But I want to point to 2, Paul Turrell and Brett Clues. In 2004, Paul Turrell invoked Martin Luther King Jr.'s book titled, "Where Do We Go From Here?" in his address that examined what he called a possible midlife crisis for community psychology. Turrell argued that part of what CP needed to do, and by extension SCRA, was to promote the expansion of the field and seek out relationships with diverse ethnic, geographic, and disciplinary groups. I think it's fair to say that we have been relatively successful in growing the inclusivity of our membership. In 2015, Brett Clues revisited these themes and expanded upon them using a gardener's metaphor. Clues called for CP to, quote, create new opportunities for community psychology, to identify symbiotic relationships to sustain ourselves, and strategic separation to conserve it. Writes like a champ, doesn't he? Cross-fertilization with other disciplines, synergies, and maintaining diverse nutrient-rich fields for community psychology, strategic separation, are both necessary for growth. Building upon the gardener's insight, we all have work to do to promote the relevance and productivity of the field. The fruits of future generations of community psychologists depend on it, close quote. To that end, through our strategic planning process that we've been engaged in more recently, we have a committee focused on collaboration with the wider field to help us build more internal and external collaborations. I am also hopeful that our global engagement helps define us less as US-centered, a US-centered organization, and more as a global one. I'll point out here that the theme of the 2023 biennial was also, where do we go from here? Dreaming new community futures. In part, it was an effort to build on the 2021 biennial, uprooting white supremacy, and the churning of SCRA extending from the 2020 call to action on anti-Black racism. As well, in my view, as a recognition of what I interpreted as a readiness of the membership to engage in the subsequent transformative work of community psychology and the Society for Community Research and Action. As we look beyond the biennials and our training programs, we should also consider leveraging the representation of community psychology, of the Community Psychology Project in other ways. For SCRA, this means being intentional about formal and informal collaborations and partnerships, not only across the psychology universe, but more importantly, beyond. CP recognizes the imperative of multidisciplinary engagement in addressing social problems. And while we are most comfortable with working with other social sciences, this work requires us to find productive ways to work with humanists, technologists, physical scientists, engineers, and health sciences, and what I believe is increasingly essential for communities, those researchers, scholars, and organizations focusing on wealth building with communities. For instance, some of my recent work is connected to activities designed to build a solidarity economy involving collective entrepreneurial enterprises and cooperative and worker-owned businesses. There is an opportunity, I believe, for SCRA to grow these transdisciplinary connections formally. In addition, given that our training programs are at the heart of community psychology, and the fact that those programs exist within our most potent societal institutions, I asked the question, what if we can extend the CP idea to reflect higher education institutions as a whole? Indeed, at least for public institutions, the public demands more and more. That is, for universities to address major societal issues seriously and aggressively. Deal with those messy problems. Seriously and aggressively engage the grand challenges of our time. Indeed, that was part of what the SCRA founders were struggling with then and what most of us care about now. My current job is leading that work at Michigan State University, leading efforts to build an engaged campus that strives to generate, exchange, and apply mutually beneficial and socially helpful knowledge and practices developed through active partnerships between the academy and communities. I envision and approach my current job as the advancement of the Community Psychology Project. Indeed, I think it is the institutionalization of community psychology. As those of you who work in the academy know, an engaged scholarship is a heavy lift, mainly if you are in the tenure system. Most tenure policies do not fully recognize research and scholarship that prioritize community impact, reciprocity, and in particular the time it takes to produce scholarly products typically seen as true scholarship. It is sometimes why community psychology often exists on the margins of our departments and is often at risk for survival. The scholarship of engagement is designed to train faculty, researchers, staff, students how to do community engaged work. I'll say how to do community psychology that is scholarly, relevant, and productive. We do this in discipline-specific, cross-disciplinary ways, and if we do it well, potentially transdisciplinary ways. Moreover, if we do it well, it extends the value of higher education into communities in more authentic and less extractive ways. If we do it well, we leverage the university's power in ways that can have a more significant impact than our individual or programmatic research and engagement initiatives. Community psychology, of course, has known and been doing this work since its beginning. Ultimately, it matters less if the work is seen as community psychology, but rather as engaged transformational scholarship for the institution and the communities with which it partners. And finally, as I mentioned before, I think the health of the organization, SCRA, the Society for Community Research and Action, is relatively strong. And in no small part due to the participation of our members, the work of the councils, committees, and interest groups, the leadership and support provided by our administrative folks, and perhaps most importantly, the efforts of so many who leaned into the community psychology project.